I walked into that hospital like I didn't exist. No title, no authority, no one knew who I was. A young female executive looked at me and said, in front of everyone, "You don't have permission to be here." I didn't argue. I asked one small question. It didn't embarrass her right away, but it made the entire system start to shake. And by the time they realized who I was, it was already too late to fix anything.
I learned something very early in life. In the cleanest buildings, the biggest mistakes are often hidden the best. This hospital proudly displays the slogan, "Patients first." But when I stood in the main lobby, what I saw were people being pushed to the edges by decisions signed behind closed doors. No one there thought I mattered, and that made them speak more honestly than usual. I didn't come to judge anyone. I came to listen. And in that moment, I met the woman who started everything. I was standing near the reception desk when a young nurse was being scolded right in front of patients and their families. Not because she made a mistake, not because she violated protocol, but because she asked too many questions. The woman raising her voice wasn't angry. She wasn't rude. She didn't need to be. Her name was Victoria Hale, Director of Operations. She spoke calmly, professionally, each sentence perfectly aligned with policy. "We don't have to budget for this request. Follow the approved procedure. Let's not create a bad precedent." Every word sounded reasonable. Every word closed another door. The patient on the emergency bed was an elderly woman. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Her chest rose with effort. One thin hand trembled as it clutched a worn hospital blanket. I looked at the vital signs monitor. Most numbers were within range. One wasn't. It flickered slightly out of alignment. Not enough to cause panic. Enough to raise concern. I turned to the nurse and asked quietly, "When was this equipment last inspected?" She looked at me, hesitated, then leaned closer and whispered, 3 months ago. Victoria heard it. For the first time, she turned and looked directly at me. Her expression wasn't hostile. It was assessing. The look of someone deciding whether you matter. "Who are you?" she asked. I answered simply, "A family member." She nodded, polite and controlled. "Then I'm going to have to ask you to step outside," she said. "We're handling internal matters." No one in the lobby said a word. Not the nurses, not the doctors, not the people sitting with clipboards and insurance forms. They were used to this, used to decisions being made above their heads, used to silence being safer than questions. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't challenge her authority. I asked one more question. "In the worst-case scenario," I said slowly, "who signs off that this equipment is still safe to use?" Victoria paused. Just for a moment. Barely noticeable. But it was there. Then she straightened slightly and prepared to answer. That pause told me everything. It told me this wasn't about medical judgment. It wasn't about patient care. It was about responsibility. And more importantly, about who carried it when things went wrong. She hadn't answered yet, but I already knew something important. I wasn't in the wrong place. I was exactly where I needed to be. Victoria didn't raise her voice. She smiled, the kind of smile worn by people who are used to winning in conference rooms. "You're interfering with an emergency protocol," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, but not loud enough to be considered disrespectful. She gestured toward security, not to remove me, just to step closer, close enough to remind everyone who controlled the space. "Every decision made here has a responsible party," Victoria continued calmly, "and that person is not you." I nodded. "Good," I said, "because I only want to know the name of that person." A young doctor nearby opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes dropped to the floor. Victoria turned toward him immediately. "Dr. Reed," she said, her voice light, almost kind. "You're on shift. Please focus on the patient." That name stayed with me. Michael Reed. He was the only person in the room who didn't look away when our eyes met. He glanced at the monitor, then back at me. He didn't say a word. Victoria continued building her wall of paperwork. This equipment was approved for temporary extension. There's a signature. There's an official stamp. There's documentation on file. She spoke like she was reciting scripture. each sentence another brick. I asked softly, "Temporary extension, for how long?" "Until new funding is allocated," Victoria answered without hesitation. "And that funding," I asked, "is decided by whom?" This time she didn't respond right away. She looked at me longer than before. Then she said it. "The CEO." A pause. "Daniel Carter." The room grew quieter. That name carried weight. I nodded. "Then that clarifies things." I turned to Dr. Reed. "In the event this patient's condition deteriorates," I asked him, "what will you write in your report?" He swallowed. 1 second. 2. "I'll write the truth," he said. Victoria smiled again. Not a happy smile, a legal one. "The truth," she repeated, "is usually the fastest way to lose your job." No one reacted.
Because everyone knew she was right. The truth, without protection, was dangerous. I took a step back, not because I was intimidated, but because I had already learned what I needed. "Thank you," I said, "for explaining everything so clearly." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "You still haven't answered my question," she said. "Who are you?" I looked at her. I didn't answer. Instead, I said one last thing. "I hope Mr. Carter's signature is placed very carefully." I turned and walked away. No one stopped me. No one called after me. But I knew that from that moment on, Victoria would begin rereading every email she had ever sent, every approval, every forwarded instruction, every message that relied on silence instead of confirmation. And somewhere else in that building, a man named Daniel Carter was about to receive a phone call that wasn't on his schedule.
I left the lobby, but I didn't leave the hospital. There are places that don't require a badge, only patience. The hallway behind the emergency wing had no slogans, no framed posters, no polished surfaces meant for visitors, just the sharp smell of disinfectant and the steady hum of aging machines, ticking like a countdown clock. Dr. Reed followed me. He didn't look directly at me. "You shouldn't ask questions like that," he said quietly. "I know," I replied, "but you were about to answer." He stopped walking. "She's not wrong," he said after a moment. "Writing the truth," he paused, "is usually the fastest way to disappear." I turned to face him. "Then why are you still here?" I asked. He gave a small smile. Not happy, not sad, just tired. "Because someone has to stay," he said. "And because patients don't get a choice." He began to talk, slowly, carefully, about equipment labeled as temporarily extended, again and again. About emergency cases being transferred out, not because of medical necessity, but because no one wanted the liability on record. About emails that were never sent, instructions given verbally, decisions designed to leave no paper trail. "No one orders anyone to die," he said. "They just sign documents that make sure someone else doesn't have the tools to save them." I asked him, "Do you have proof?" He nodded. Not documents, not classified files. He unlocked his phone. A schedule appeared on the screen. "This," he said. 3 cases, 6 months. Patient names, dates, equipment malfunctions. All officially ruled as complications, he continued. But I know they didn't have to end that way. I stared at the screen for a long time. "You've never sent this," I said. "No," he replied, "because sending it would end my career." I nodded. "And if you don't," I said, "you'll live with it forever." He didn't answer. We stood there, between the machines, between people who had no idea that their lives had been reduced to a very quiet conversation in a forgotten hallway. "Who are you?" he finally asked. For the first time, I answered. "I'm someone who can make sure your silence doesn't become professional suicide." He looked at me again. This time really looked. "And what do you want in return?" he asked. "I need you," I said, "to stand by every word when they start denying everything." He took a deep breath, a very deep one. "You should know," he said, "once this starts, there's no way back." I nodded. "For me," I replied, "there hasn't been a way back for a long time." Upstairs, Victoria Hale was asking legal to review older reports. In another office, Daniel Carter had just ended a meeting, and for the first time that day, noticed his name appearing in an email thread he didn't remember reading closely. As for Dr. Reed and me, we didn't shake hands. We didn't make promises. We simply placed the truth on the table. And from that moment on, this story stopped being about me. It became something else, a problem no one in that building could sign away.
The meeting was labeled urgent. No one asked why. The conference room was small, frosted glass, no windows, just 4 people. Daniel Carter sat at the head of the table, perfectly tailored suit, the calm voice of a man accustomed to controlling the pace of other people's breathing. Victoria Hale sat to his right, hands neatly folded on a stack of folders, no expression, as if this were just another routine review. Michael Reed sat across from them, still in his scrubs, nothing with him except his phone. And me. I didn't sit. I stood. Daniel spoke first. "We're wasting time," he said. "If there's an issue, say it plainly." I nodded. "Good," I said. "Then we'll skip introductions." I looked directly at Victoria. "How many times did you extend equipment usage without reporting risk exposure?" She answered immediately. "There's no obligation to report until a threshold is crossed." "What threshold?" I asked. She paused. Half a second. "The legal threshold." I turned to Daniel. "How many documents have you signed without reading the attached appendices?" Daniel gave a thin smile. "That's the responsibility of the operations department." "Then," I said, "do you take responsibility for those signatures?" Daniel leaned back slightly. "Are you accusing me of something?" I gestured toward Michael. He unlocked his phone. He didn't project it on a screen. He didn't need to. He read aloud. Dates, times, shifts, equipment failures. 3 cases. 3 identical decisions. No word labeled error. Only the word temporary. Victoria spoke up. "This is not evidence." Michael looked at her. "No," he said. "This is my shift log." Daniel placed his hand flat on the table. "This has gone far enough." I cut in. "No," I said. "It hasn't even started." I placed a thin folder on the table. No stamps, no seals. "This is a comparison," I said, "between so-called cost savings and abnormal patient transfers." For the first time, Victoria's expression changed. Daniel looked at the folder, then at me. "Who are you?" he asked. I answered slowly. "I'm someone authorized to review every signature from the past 6 years." The room went silent. No one asked another question. They understood. Victoria spoke first. "You knew," she said to Daniel. "You were aware of the risk." Daniel turned to her, his eyes cold. "You proposed it, and you signed it," I said. No one disagreed. Michael stood. "Excuse me," he said. "I can't continue my shift until this is addressed." Daniel looked at him. "Is that a threat?" Michael shook his head. "No," he said. "It's documentation." I walked to the door. "This meeting isn't over," I said. "It's just been moved to a different format." I opened the door. Hallway light flooded in. "Within 24 hours," I added. "Every decision made today will be reviewed by people who weren't in this room." Daniel said nothing. Victoria said nothing. But I knew that when the door closed, what they heard most clearly wasn't my footsteps leaving. It was the sound of their signatures beginning to find their way back to the people who wrote them. There were no termination notices, no police officers, no breaking headlines. Just small things starting to happen all at once. The next morning, the legal department sent a very short email, requesting an immediate suspension of all decisions related to emergency equipment over the past 6 months. Victoria read the email while holding her coffee. She set the cup down. She didn't take another sip. On another floor, Daniel Carter walked into his office and noticed something unusual. His schedule was empty. Not canceled, not deleted. Just no one was scheduling meetings for him anymore. Michael Reed continued his shifts, but this time every report he filed was backed up in 3 separate systems. No one told him he was protected, but he knew. Because for the first time in years, no email arrived asking him to adjust the wording. 3 days later, an independent committee appeared. No signage, no press conference. They asked for only one thing: the original records. Victoria attended the first session. She brought complete documentation, presented smoothly, left no obvious gaps, until one member of the committee asked, "Why wasn't this decision escalated to the Risk Review Board?" Victoria answered on instinct, "Because the CEO approved it." Daniel sat across the table, silent. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. That silence made Victoria's answer far more complete than she intended. At the second session, Daniel didn't attend. His attorney came instead. He spoke at length about misunderstandings, but he couldn't explain one thing: why the signature was still there. Michael Reed was asked to testify, not in court, just in another room. Fewer people, but better listeners. He didn't describe feelings. He read data. Each number represented a delayed decision.
Each decision represented a patient who didn't get another chance. No one interrupted. 1 week later, Victoria Hale requested an indefinite leave of absence, not because she was forced to, but because there was nothing left to sign. Daniel Carter kept his title, but not his authority. Every document now required a different signature before reaching his desk, a signature he didn't recognize. As for me, I didn't return to the hospital. There was no need. I received a final report, long, dry, accurate. On the last page, one small line stood out: Recommendation: Structural governance changes. I closed the report. Some victories don't feel satisfying. They bring only one thing: silence. And in that silence, I knew this story had reached the place it needed to go. Not because someone lost, but because from that moment on, no one would be allowed to win by staying silent.
No official announcement was ever released. The hospital still opened every morning. Staff still clocked in on time. The hallways were still bright. It just felt different. Some things were gone. The emails that carried verbal instructions. The decisions with no clear owner. The sentences that always began with, "Just do it, I'll handle it." After his final shift of the week, Michael Reed spoke to me quietly. "No one thanked us," he said. "But at least now, everything is written down." I nodded. That's enough. Daniel Carter no longer appeared in the main lobby. His office was still there, but the door was usually closed. Victoria Hale left without a word. No scandal, no farewell email. Just an empty position no one rushed to fill. Eventually, I was asked the question I had been expecting. "So who are you, really?" I answered with a sentence that didn't include a name. "I'm someone who doesn't need to be seen for things to work the way they should." I didn't return to the conference room. There was no reason to. Good systems don't require heroes. They only require people who are no longer willing to stay silent. Before I left, I paused for a moment in the emergency lobby. The elderly woman from that day had been transferred. She was stable. No one remembered me, and I liked it that way. Because this story was never about who won. It was about a very small moment when a question was asked and no one was brave enough to ignore it. That was when everything changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly enough that from that day forward, no one could ever say they didn't know.